Thanks so much to all of you who are joining us today. My name is Renee. I'm the Executive Director of OpenSky Policy Institute. And welcome to our webinar. We are thrilled to have Senator John Stinner, who's the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, as well as former Senator John Kuehn, who was a member of the Appropriations Committee and is now a member of the Economic Forecasting Board. So thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So for those of you who are on the webinar who are unfamiliar with the OpenSky Policy Institute, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We focus on budget and tax policy and education finance. So I want to help the rest of that. I want to, thank the rest of the OpenSky team for their help with this webinar. And you can see a couple of dark icons on here. They are Chuck Brown, our communications director, and Craig Beck, our fiscal analyst, and they're going to be helping with technology and managing questions today. So as you know, the Economic Forecasting Board just met, literally just met. So we all just got to our seats a minute ago and are still getting a little settled here. And so they met and determined the amount of revenue that they believe is available for state budget priorities. So we thought you would want to hear from Senator Kuehn about the discussions that the board had and the decisions that they made, and from Senator Stinner about how the forecast factors into discussions on the budget and other legislation. So just a few housekeeping issues before we get started. The webinar is being recorded, so that will be available following the webinar. And attendees will be on mute for the entire duration of the webinar. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. However, please limit yourself to no more than 2 questions. So that will be a little bit easier for us to manage and will give more people an opportunity to ask questions. We have received some questions in advance that we'll start with, but we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with Senator Kuehn. So Senator Kuehn, would you please start by telling us a little bit about what the Forecasting Board does and why it is so important to the legislative process?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. The Nebraska Economic Forecasting Advisory Board is a 9-member panel with half of the membership appointed by the legislature and the other half of the membership appointed by the governor. And with the assistance of the Legislative Fiscal Office, as well as the Department of Revenue, the Forecasting Board meets and considers a number of economic forecasts that are put together by both the legislative and the executive branch from 2 different services, IHS and Moody's. And using all of those professional economic forecasts, along with the current revenue data, the board sets the general fund revenue forecast. So we basically have, to oversimplify, 3 big appropriations buckets in the state of Nebraska. So there are cash funds, there's federal funds, and then there's the general fund. So the general fund includes your sales and use tax paid to the state, personal income tax, corporate income tax, and then this smaller bucket called miscellaneous tax, which is everything else. So the board meets, and considering all of those economic forecasts, we provide through a vote of the board a consensus number on what we project for the coming fiscal year each of those different revenue streams are. So in this case today, we looked at the 2020-2021 fiscal year, which started July 1st and goes through next year, June 30th, and set a figure for how much we expect the state of Nebraska will accumulate in revenue in sales and use, personal income tax, corporate income tax, and those miscellaneous taxes.
Great, that's super helpful. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And if you could kick us off, Senator Kuehn, and let us know what your thoughts were on the board's forecast. In particular, I think you became the new Fred Lockwood today a little bit with some feelings, some strong feelings, and a few no votes. But in particular, you did raise some concerns about the income tax numbers. And anyway, so if you would share your thoughts about the forecast in general, and maybe a little bit about some of the dialogue that was going on, would be helpful.
You know, I think we all expected, based on the projections and just being aware of the current economic situation, that we would see a decrease in the amount of revenue projected compared to what we looked at the end of February. So the last time the forecasting board met was February 28th, was just on the cusp of the beginning of the pandemic. So it should come as no surprise that we anticipated that the 5.3 billion that was projected in February was not likely to come into this next fiscal year. Just so all the participants are aware, I was a bit of an outlier on the board in this session, just in terms of kind of where the discussion was. The discussion really focused around the revenue impact of a number of not only the impact of the pandemic and the economic consequences of the businesses and economic activity that was shut down, but also really trying to factor in the impact of the various stimulus packages, whether it is tax changes in the CARES Act, whether it is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided financial loans and assistance to employers, and how that would ultimately impact the revenue over the course of the next year. So the discussion really focused on where we thought and where individual members felt that those programs were going to influence the overall amount of revenue that the state was going to take in. I think we all recognize that although there'll be a small decrease, the board decreased the sales and use tax by about 55 million. Obviously, consumer spending has remained high up to now, and we anticipate that's going to be fairly stable. As you mentioned, the real discrepancy came in the individual income tax and the corporate income tax numbers, where the big difference of opinion on the board was to what degree IHS and Moody's had factored in the impact in particular of the PPP loan program on revenue and receipts in those areas. So individual income tax also includes a lot of your sole proprietorships and some businesses like LLCs that are passed through. So there's many small businesses which file under the individual income tax bracket, and there are many of those who may have received that PPP assistance. So it was my personal opinion that we needed to really kind of be within the bounds of what IHS and Moody's looked at. They're the economic specialists. They do this as their business. And my interpretation and read of the information provided to us, in particular by the Department of Revenue's background, was that both IHS and Moody's had taken into account the full scope of the CARES Act and the stimulus in their revenue projections going forward. Other members of the board felt that the impact of PPP, particularly the high participation rate of Nebraska businesses in that program compared to other states, was not adequately accounted for in those revenue projections, and therefore chose to go above and beyond, in some cases pretty extreme, the projections by IHS and Moody's. So that's where a lot of the discussion came around. The ultimate decision was to set the individual income tax number at 2.7 billion for next year, and the corporate income tax at 440 million. Just for a bit of perspective on the personal income tax, the highest projection we had was 2.698, which was one outlier with IHS from the fiscal office. And on the corporate side, the highest projection was that the same with IHS at 361 million. So the board opted to project a corporate income tax of about 20% greater than the highest estimate from our economic forecast. So that's where the discussion kind of was. I chose a little bit more of the middle ground. I think if we're going to use evidence, we need to trust the experts and use their evidence as the basis for our decisions. But some members of the board had discussion that felt they had a different perspective.
And just so for folks who don't attend forecasting board meetings regularly, you actually get 4 different estimates, right?
Correct. Yeah. So the Department of Revenue provides 2 estimates. So they get one estimate from IHS and they get one estimate from Moody's using numbers that are produced by the Department of Revenue. The Legislative Fiscal Office uses the same service, but they use the numbers that are used and created by the legislative branch. So it's important to remember these are economic models, and the number that comes out of the model is completely dependent upon the variables that you put in it. So subtle differences and slight changes in those variables, the input, can create differences. So we as a board are given 4 different numbers for each of those revenue categories based on the parameters that are put in, and then we use those typically as kind of the guide rails and the bumpers to guide our individual estimates and votes.
So just to rehash then. So you guys ended up actually higher than all 4 of the estimates that Department of Revenue and Legislative Fiscal Office had from IHS and Moody's.
That is correct, yes.
There was sort of a comment in the meeting. It was sort of subtle around the sales tax refunds, around incentives. Maybe you can kind of share what that conversation was about.
So one of the things that we have to kind of project and factor into that sales and use tax number is what refunds may be present in the future and anticipated based on current existing incentive programs. So companies earn credits and refunds that they have the option by which then they can collect at their discretion. So it's not something that we budget. We try to forecast it based on the anticipated needs. So in this particular forecast, we actually had taken into account 155 million of potential sales and use tax refunds that may come in the course of the next year. That's purely a speculative number. There's some information based on anticipation of some really large companies which may be seeking those refunds. But again, that's part of the challenge of really setting a revenue forecast in a year like this year, where this forecast decreased revenue compared to our February forecast by 196 million. That's significant. And I'm sure Senator Stinner is going to talk about what the impacts of that $196 million decrease are. When you start talking about $155 million figures, which may or may not come in that sales tax revenue, that is a significant impact on how the policy decisions are made around that revenue and how the legislature can utilize that money going forward.
So just a couple more questions and then I'll turn it over to Senator Stinner. But one thing that I thought I took away from what Wafu was saying was that the sales tax numbers in FY20 actually looked better because you had budgeted for a larger incentive project that didn't come in. And so did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, correct. So one of the challenges with all of these unpredictable refunds are that we don't know when they're going to happen. So they budget for them and then anticipate, and then if they don't occur, they just get pushed forward into the subsequent year. So in previous forecasts, we'd taken into account the anticipation of a relatively large refund in the tens of millions. And since that did not occur, that got shifted forward into this forecast in the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year. It's not unlike some of the shifts that occurred. So I'm sure your audience are all every 15th of the month are waiting with bated breath for the revenue reports, and they're looking at them very carefully. And you may have noticed that the revenue has looked somewhat different in the pattern in which we have received that revenue because of the postponement of the filing deadline for income taxes from April 15th to July 15th. So we've had a number of shifts which have made kind of comparing year to year a bit of a challenge, and certainly a challenge in predicting both the revenue as well as then anticipating how that impacts the budget of the state.
And so actually, because you mentioned that, that was something that I finally really clicked for me, and it was a question I was going to have for Senator Stinner, but since you mentioned it, and then I can have Senator Stinner sort of reiterate. So the forecast in FY21, so it's really, to a certain extent, sort of being buoyed a little bit by the income tax that moved into this year. So what are the implications then for FY22, which you didn't pick up yet, but.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is we're just kicking that can down the road with a little bit of uncertainty. I mean, that is one of the big challenge of, with forecasting. We're not only trying to read the tea leaves and anticipate what may be happening 12 months or 24 months out economically and the economy as a whole, but also anticipating individual business decisions over which, we have no real knowledge. And we're just trying to guess based on, some information that companies may provide back, but also, just historical patterns when that may come forward. So again, if that refund is not taken in this fiscal year, it simply gets kicked down the road to the next fiscal year.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
So don't go anywhere, Senator Kuehn. We'll have some more questions for you later. But Senator Stinner, so what do you think?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Senator Kuehn. This was a special request for the forecasting board. The next time they meet is October, and obviously there'll be some more adjusting to do to the revenue. But thank you, and thank the forecasting board for their effort. Lots of time and effort goes into it in preparation, and certainly I was using actually the average of Moody's and IHS, which was down 340, and I was just looking and redoing the calculation. That would have meant that we would have been off below the 3% minimum reserve that we need to cash reserve by about 50 million. So we would have had to figure out where we came up with by cuts or possibly lapses to make up 50. With this more optimistic forecast, I was just doing calculations, so my head's down. I'm doing some quick calculations. We'll still have about $88 million for the floor based on my calculation. And I, as I had indicated in the past, excuse me, I'm sorry. I wasn't really that much concerned with this year. It's really the impact in the out years. And especially when we're taking a look at some large figures for property tax relief and some of the other things that we're going to try to get done, which is the incentive program that, excuse me. I am sorry. That burdens the out years. So we're trying to get a feel for where we should be. Obviously, if we take IHS's reports and push that forward, I think, and just using their reports, our out years look like we're going to have a negative $500+ million to make up for. So those are some rather large numbers and some adjusting to be done. But the good news is we don't have to cut. We have 88 million for the floor property tax, incentive programs, or any other bills that have fiscal notes are now open for the legislature. So that's the good news. You know, another cautionary note is we're down to $388 million in our rainy day fund. With the uncertainty, I've always tried to push for a minimum reserve of 500 million. If we do replace with the 83 million, you know, that brings it back up to 465 million. A little bit concerned about that. In fact, personally, I'm very concerned about that, especially as I start to look at the out years, especially. I'm not as optimistic as some people are, but I have to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to use what I have in front of me, data from IHS, data from Moody's, and try to incorporate that into the next biennium and what we may be looking at there. And in the cautionary note is always, how big of a cushion do we have? And because we're in uncharted territories, the pandemic has thrown a lot of curves in this, along with, you know, zero interest rates were mentioned, the prop and what that effect is on housing. Certainly with the bridge money, I call it bridge, some people call it stimulus, it's bridge money, whether it be PPP, the unemployment compensation, that will run out, but it's been significant dollars that have been injected into our economy and basically has bridged our economy. And I think a lot of it has to do with the makeup of our economy, because we're more ag-based, and so money's actually going to go out to aid ag, certainly cattle feeders as well as the ag producers. So that's helpful to bridge it. My big concern is when the real economy has to take over, where are we going to be? And are we going to be able to continue to try to accelerate out of this? You know, I still reflect on the CBO report that I saw this summer or early summer, and they were talking about not getting back to pre-COVID, a pre-COVID economy until 2028. I think IHS and Moody's reflect on 2023, 24 as maybe a date that we can look to, but certainly they're not predicting this V-shaped recovery. But thank God we live in Nebraska. The impact has not been as significant as other states. I think Steve Saline, who sits on that, has radio stations reflected on his radio station in Illinois, revenues off 50%, only 10% in Nebraska. So that's really kind of demonstrates the strength of our economy, the type of economy we have, and also emphasizes the importance of agriculture.
So Senator Stinner, just one clarification. You mentioned the $83 million. For folks that may not be familiar with that, that was the money that the Appropriations Committee took and essentially provided to the governor as an emergency appropriation.
Yes, that was a bill that we passed in our, I call it a special session, that 2 days or 3 days we came back. We gave $83 million, gave it to him in his emergency fund to be used for the COVID. I believe that they've spent about 18 million of that right now. That will be replaced hopefully by federal money. There may be some contingencies because this COVID money does run out at 12/31. There may be some money held back into the emergency fund, just for contingencies, anything that would go over. And we'll see what the federal government comes up with again. Apparently they're putting together a package, and we'll see what that looks like. So far, we have not been able to use any money for general purposes or revenue shortfalls. So we're still having to deal with that. There'll still be some discussion. I saw legislation brought, or pending legislation by Senator Breezy about decoupling. That's trying to do away with the effects of the tax change on the federal income tax. It's about $125 million impact. I don't know what that discussion is going to look like. I think it's scheduled for hearing next week, early next week. We'll see where that comes. That would be an adjustment and a source of revenue for us. We'll see. We'll just see how that discussion works.
So question for you about, so we've got 80 million on the floor. You heard Senator Kuehn talk a little bit about how that was significantly more than the forecasters were predicting. Do you have any concerns with you utilizing all of that you might have to?
Or could be adjusted out simply because there's so many unknowns in the COVID. So we'll see what happens.
And maybe we can walk through a little bit why the out years, and this was what I was talking with Senator Kuehn about a little bit, but essentially, as I understand it, the income tax revenue that we were expecting that came in July instead of April has now gone into the February 21 forecast instead of going into the cash reserve, essentially, right?
I think so, yes.
So then, and is that why then the out years look so bad? Because essentially we have like one-time dollars that are kind of propping up our baseline. That
would be something that is an add, yes, and it would be propping it up. The out years are based on, and what we try to do is use that 4.7% average growth in our calculations. We will change that and really try to push down the projection to the Moody's growth rate. So you're about 3 to 3.6% growth factor for the 2 out years as it relates to revenue growth. And of course, then plugging in, a kind of a baseline spending. I think what they've been using, I'm just looking right now, 3.2% as a baseline spending that's projected out. And that basically, that's the source, and then you subtract the expenses, and that's where you get the negative, a fairly substantial negative figure, which is right now, based on the calculations, is probably around $500 million of shortfall. So we'd have to cut expenses or generate some kind of revenue. So it certainly brings pause to the conversation of passing any large bills that have future impact on expenses and or revenue. So that will have to be discussed. I don't know if you watched the debate yesterday. I weighed in a few times. I was like Dr. Death out there. But I was trying to get some kind of fiscal recognition for where we're at. And obviously pointed to this day and as evidence, but well, we got 88 million and I don't have to find $50 million in cuts. So that's good news and bad news, right?
Right. So is your concern then, or I should ask if do you have a concern then if we were to fully utilize that 88 million and let's say that the forecasters were right, IHS and Moody's were right. So we're actually should be a couple $100 million less than where we're at. I mean, what does that do to your job in January then?
Well, that's what I've said on the floor is I'm not that much concerned about how to adjust and make this work. It's the next biennium that I'm very much concerned with. And I guess I'm a little less optimistic as it relates to recovery. So I think that COVID will take a 2-3 year period of time. I think it's going to be a slow haul to get out of where we're at today, and that will reflect on revenue. So if it reflects on revenue, then obviously we got less and less to spend. And if you have projected out, basically an imbalance relative to your budget, you're going to have to make substantial changes, which is substantial cuts. And I think Senator Kuehn's been there before, and it's not very fun. And it seems like that's all I've had to do is cut. So.
Yes, it certainly does. I'm going to remind the audience, if you have questions at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box there. Please go ahead and add your questions to the Q&A. So Senator Stinner, is it possible that we could find ourselves in a situation where you're having to do 2 budgets in January again? I think
yeah, if it's a deep hole, we're probably, I mean, the last time around, I think we were 900 million when we showed up. And it really required an adjustment of the current budget that we were in, the current budget year. And that kind of prepared us or gave us a runway for the next biennium, and then we started to cut from there. So, yeah, I don't want to have to do 2 budgets in 1 year. That's a little difficult.
Senator Kuehn, as a former member of the Appropriations Committee, do you have any advice for how legislators should be viewing the forecast that you just participated in?
I would say they should, follow where I was going and not the board, and then act appropriately. But just joking. I think that if senators want to avoid the potential for what Senator Stinner had indicated we had to do a couple of years ago, which was reconvene in January and do 2 budgets, do 1 budget where we cut, and you had agencies and those who had received state funds who had to somehow make up substantial cuts in the last 2 quarters of the fiscal year while simultaneously trying to do a biennial budget. I think Senator Stinner's perspective is correct in that they should look at this with an asterisk, that there was not unanimous consensus across the forecasting board with regard to the optimistic outlook, especially in those corporate and individual taxes, that those decisions are not supported by the IHS and Moody's expert analysts, and that the very real potential exists that if this overly optimistic viewpoint to the tune of another 80, 90, 100 million does not materialize, that when the board reconvenes in October, if we downgrade that forecast, that is exactly the scenario they will be in, is trying to reduce another 10, 20, 30, 40 million out of this current fiscal year. So I would be very cautious and set careful priorities about how to spend that money on the floor. And again, it requires keeping in mind what the ultimate priorities of this legislative body are going to be. Where do they feel the greatest priorities for state spending are, and putting those at the top of the list, and then understanding what discretionary spending and lower priorities come lower. So certainly understanding what happened today rather than just looking at the bottom line is important. So I hope a lot of senators and staff and special interests are tuned in right now and getting an update, because again, the forecasting board isn't a highly attended meeting, and it's kind of a bit of a black hole, if you will, in terms of what happens. Something goes in and this decision comes out and everybody looks at the decision and then starts acting ahead of time. And I think this is certainly a case where how the sausage was made is really important for the policy decisions that are going to be made by this legislative body over the course of the next couple of weeks.
Great.
Yeah, and I think that disparity between opinions really kind of demonstrates, how difficult this is in this time, because we really don't know. We don't know how to gauge this, and it's difficult. And when you're going to have a vaccine, if you're going to have a vaccine, plays in as well.
Yeah, it was interesting that even came into the discussion, right? And when forecasting board members thought that there may be a vaccine, and how that sort of played in, very unusual conversation. Senator Kuehn, I'm going to ask you this question so that Senator Stinner doesn't have to answer it. So there has, for a long time, but I think we're seeing it now when there's not revenue, where there's a bill and the effective day is delayed. Do you have any thoughts about that, particularly right now, whether that should be how we're proceeding?
I think when, Senator Stinner brought up the issue of out years and how, we sometimes, when there's not money available, appropriations are made that affect that out years. And so basically you're spending money into the future that you don't necessarily have. I think at this point, given the magnitude of uncertainty that we have, that's something that should be reserved for only extremely high priority items, things that the legislature really feels must be set as a policy now and as a super high priority, and not become common practice. We don't know what is going to happen in the out years. We have absolutely no clue at this point, and until we know things like the presence of a vaccine, like whether or not we're going to have continued shutdowns, what those out years are going to look like. And today we did not address them at all. So we didn't even take a look at 21, 22, and we won't until October. I also think that there's a second problem that is kind of at this point, which is, again, as we make these big policy decisions into the out year, many of those policy decisions are unpredictable. So if you add, for example, incentives, which we already talked a little bit about how those are unpredictable, tax expenditures, and add additional uncertainty, putting those into the out years just further complicates that picture for policymakers going forward.
Great. Senator Stinner, anything you want to say on that, or?
No, I think I'll just pass, because these are hot issues that have to be worked out. Hopefully we'll, the heat's going to turn up next week. We had a nice congenial debate yesterday, but I think it's going to get a little more heat to it. Certainly, there is incentive to get everybody together and get something passed that makes a lot of sense for the state of Nebraska. And given where we're at financially and the COVID situation, that just adds a whole different light to everything. Do you have money? Don't you have money? How you want to structure things. Those are important things to discuss, and we'll see what comes out of it.
So have a few questions here. A couple of them are a little bit politically loaded. So I know, Senator Kuehn, I'm going to ask you this question, but feel free to decline to answer. But the question was whether the intention of the forecasting board and making the forecast higher was to show revenue for incentives or property taxes. And again, feel free to decline to answer, or whatever you want to.
I guess I will say I'm not going to ascribe intentions to other members of the board. I'm not going to pretend to divine what was going in their thought process. Again, anyone who was present in the room, and Senator Stinner and Renee, you were both there. So if I'm mischaracterizing my position or what I expressed to the board, please feel free to correct me. But, again, we have evidence in front of us. And if we are to make an evidence-based decision on the forecast, we have to take into account the expert analysis that is provided to us. I am not an economist. I don't even play one on TV, and I didn't sleep in a Holiday Inn Express last night. So I'm dependent upon the experts. I really spend a lot of time with the Department of Revenue's analysis. Even things like the vaccine discussion, if you actually look at what IHS and Moody's talked about, they give us scenarios. They give us and it was kind of funny, the probability was 50% they don't know, 30% that everything's going to go down the drain, and 20% things are going to go great, which is, I know seems like not a lot of clarity, but they provide those proportional estimates of probability of where their expertise and their modeling, and they take Nebraska's data. I mean, this is not just something that they take from the macro scale and they chop up into bits and say, okay, well, 150 of this is Nebraska's slice. They're developing this analysis based on Nebraska's numbers. And so they definitely took into account in their optimistic scenario, what happens if we have a vaccine? They took into account what happens if we don't have a vaccine. So all of that was really factored in. And certainly I can only speak from my motivation and my decision. My motivation was, and the reasoning behind my vote, and even, the proposals, I'm happy to share with your webcast or your participants, exactly what I put on my sheet in terms of my votes. And my votes were in the mid-range. I look at historical trends with IHS and Moody's and the differences in the numbers, and I weight each of those four. So I don't just average them all together. I weight them based on my experience and the past performance. And, I felt that when I'm in that room and I'm making a forecast decision, my forecast decision is not to take into account any of the policy decisions that are happening on the floor of the legislature. When I was a state senator and when I was an appropriator, my job was to do those political decisions and set those priorities. My job on the forecasting board is to take that evidence, use the experience I have as a professional who was appointed because of my professional experience and judgment, and to create a forecast. So I really felt all those were in. I think based on the discussion from other members, there were others who just felt that, in particular, the PPP money, and again, some of the discussion centered around, we don't even know how that's going to be handled on a tax perspective. And that was a lot of the dialogue back between Dr. Tran and members of the board, was how is that going to be handled from an accounting perspective, and how our individual business is going to handle that on their tax return, versus what does that mean for the macroeconomic condition that is what our revenue picture is. So yes, our individual income tax revenue is the sum of all the individual income tax filings, but it also acts in aggregate. And so there's a lot of discrepancy about how that's going to play out. And as I said in my brief comments when we were going around for the forecasting board, one of my greatest concerns is our availability heuristic. We cling on to what we are available and what we see. And so if you're out in Nebraska and you're around individuals whose jobs, they've been impacted, you're maybe working remotely, but your paycheck hasn't been cut, or things are going well with your business, or you were able to get support and bridge. I think Senator Stinner used a great term, this bridge money, and you're able to buy a new home or go trade your car, you're thinking things are probably pretty okay. If you're one of these families who have lost their job, or I think probably even worse, because you may not be collecting unemployment, but your hours have been scaled back, you're making ends meet and you're making your rent payments by these additional unemployment, which, as we see in the withholding, it appears that there's a lot of people, and the withholding has been strong because they're taking that withholding from their unemployment benefits. If and when those benefits decrease or run out, we're looking at a significant potential revenue cliff. And I want to make sure when we're looking at these decisions that we're not just tapping the people that we're hanging around. So if you're hanging around other business owners, you may feel more optimistic than if you're spending time with families who are trying to figure out how they're going to pay their rent. I deal a lot with families right now who are struggling. How do we get our kids to college this fall, and how do we pay tuition bills, and how do we meet all of those obligations and balance that? And so, that is where my head is at, and that's all I can really speak to when making those decisions. And I'm happy to be completely transparent about what went into my decision-making process.
Great, thank you. And
Yeah, just a little add on to what Senator Kuehn was talking about, I think you have to reflect back. Moody's and IHS actually recommended a 10% of total revenue decrease at the outset of this thing. So that would have been 500 million. And that's what we modeled for a period of time. And I actually gave a couple presentations on what the effect was budgetarily. Generally, the forecasting board does follow pretty close to what the average is of the forecast. They've deviated this time rather significantly from it, but that's what we were using, is that average to try to project out or certainly get in front of the impact if that indeed happens. So, but you know, like I said, this COVID is so much different with the federal government participating, zero interest rate, lots of different factors. I think it's affected different communities in different ways and different people in different ways, depending on where you're at. So probably the variance from the average is really a function of the unknowns.
Yeah, great. Senator Kuehn, really quickly following up, you just made a comment and we had a couple questions about this, but the CARES Act, the tax changes was factored into the forecast. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, and that's one thing to keep in mind there. For observers who may be looking at the general fund financial status or some of the other documents that are out there, there was a $125 million impact due to tax changes in the CARES Act, and they were factored in directly. So they actually appear. That's not factored into the Moody's or the IHS or any of those estimates. That's a direct number which was factored in and taken into account.
Great. So this is a question for Senator Stinner. Given the relatively low cash reserve and high uncertainty with revenue, and the question is, wouldn't the prudent thing be to put the 88 million shown for the floor into the cash reserve fund? But maybe what?
I think that's good advice. If I can convince somebody to do that, I will. You know, we've talked a lot about cash reserves or the unknowns, and certainly the out years. Having a higher reserve would certainly provide us a more of an economic cushion, shock absorber, if you will, and as we move forward. And nobody knows if there's going to be a vaccine, what the impact's going to be. I think we've seen, actually, the state of Nebraska's unemployment rate has trended upward. It went from 5% to over 6%. So we've got some trends going that way. I noticed on the national news that we had unemployment starting to tick up again, simply because other states are having to close again. So those are all factors. And how, you know, do we have a second wave? And Senator Kuehn could probably express more profoundly than I am about where we're at with the virus. Is it treatable, or is it going to be treatable? What's it going to morph into? Lots of questions. So yeah, the prudent thing would be, as all businesses are doing right now, they go to cash when there's unknown. They build working capital. They actually borrow from banks or lenders and stick that cash in their financial statement to build their working capital to cushion them for the unknown. So it would be prudent for us. Yes, I agree.
And this isn't related to the forecast, but we had a question about what role, if any, the legislature has in allocating any of the CARES funding. I think you've already talked to this in the media, but
yeah, you know, people have to understand when we put the bill together and gave permission to the governor to put it in his emergency fund to use for COVID-related activities. That's an open-ended situation. So when all of that federal money came in, he was also granted that. And I think you saw the Attorney General's opinion relative to that. The other thing that people have to understand is the money coming from the federal government is not for general use. So it's very prescriptive. And the concern everybody has, and I think rightly so, is we have to spend the money. We got to account for it. They've set up a separate accounting system within the accounting system so that they can account for those dollars, and it's transparent as it can possibly be, but it has to be spent for those purposes. We don't want to get into a situation where we've made up something and spent it and then get a clawback. And that's, I think, what I think the governor's office has talked a little bit about that, but I've certainly, the conversations I've had with his budget director, with the governor, that is a concern. Is certainly trying to account for it being as compliant as they possibly can, and then making sure that, and we do have about 200 and some, or maybe even 300 and some still left over from what he put into is a kind of a contingency fund. Now, if they change their mind in Congress and allow us to use it for general use, the procedure would be to put it into the rainy day fund and then appropriate it out of there. That law is in 2004, I believe. So, but that, we do not have general use money yet out of the COVID stuff. But yeah, we could pass statutes directing the governor to use this money for COVID-related stuff, which aligns itself with the federal government. But I think he's trying to do that. I think he's been fiscally responsible, and frankly, I think he's done a really good job trying to COVID.
So we just had a question from a senator, and we covered this early on, but I want to ask it again because there may be some folks who joined late, and I think it's a really important question. So the question is, in what way was the forecasting board's estimate different from IHS Moody's projections? And did the board settle on a more optimistic estimate than projected? And are you comfortable with their estimate? So maybe that was multiple questions in there, but so we've covered this, but maybe we can just recover or reiterate a little bit.
So I'm gonna throw some numbers out, and just so everyone's accurate and knows what's going on, just to give everyone a perspective. So grab your pencils, otherwise tune out. So as far as what the board did, and I'm just going to give you the averages of all four so you can take a look at them. So the average of all four estimates for sales tax was 1.752 billion. What the board settled on was 1.765. So in sales and use tax, they were a little bit higher than the average. The individual income tax average was 2.664 billion. What the board settled on was 2.7 billion. So the high of all of the estimate of all of the models was 2.698, and individual, the board actually went 2 million above the highest, most optimistic. On corporate, the average was 347 million. And the board opted for 440 million. So the board went 93 million above the average of the four, which on 347 is about 25% above the average. The high was 361 million. And then miscellaneous, the average was 216 of all of the forecast models, and the board went with 220 million, so a little bit up. So if you look at what the average of four that Senator Stinner referred to, that they were kind of working off of as they were trying to do some modeling, the average for the general fund revenue for the 2020-21 year of all four would have been 4.98 billion. So just a scotch under $5 billion. Where the board went with was a total of 5.125 billion. So about $145 million above the average of the models. Again, that is not where I went with either my votes or my perspective. I can't say that I'm uncomfortable with it per se. I think it's overly optimistic, and I think it means that legislators need to act with caution so they're not having to undo appropriations. I would have preferred to have seen, just again in the spirit of transparency, as I put together kind of my estimates, my estimate that I would have gone with would have been a total of about 4.975 billion, which was a little bit about 5 million under the average of all four, and that's just using a methodology that I've used based on the performance of the different models. So that's where we're at. That's a lot of numbers. If somebody wants more, they're happy to reach out, and I know you guys will probably be putting out those numbers and referencing them as well. But that's where the numbers were from this morning.
Great, thank you. Senator Stinner, want to talk about your comfort level with where they landed?
Well, I mean, this is the process we use to establish revenue, and then obviously we have to react to it to balance our budget with a 3% cash reserve. So that's what we'll work with. Having 88 million for the floor or thereabouts in a time of uncertainty with a depleted rainy day fund. I think I've talked numerous times about that. There's a lot of concerns when we look at the next 2 years biennium. There appears to be at least a $500 million shortfall there that will have to be adjusted for. That creates a lot of concern. So big cautionary note for everybody. Obviously, there's a lot of passion, a lot of desire to do property tax, myself included, and obviously the incentive as well. But I would be cautious.
And maybe just an opportunity to educate too. So let's say that 80 million is spent, right? And so then that is baked into the FY21, right?
Yes.
And then it ends up being overly optimistic. You're already projecting, or the forecasters and the numbers you have looked at, you're already thinking we're going to be down 500-600 million in the following biennium.
That's what it appears to be right now, but I'm using IHS numbers. So if they're somewhere close, say within a 100 million, that's it's still a big number to adjust to.
So if we spend that full 83 million and
that will add to expenditures, which will make the 500 actually go up by whatever we spend. So an increase in spending will end up carrying over into the next biennium, and obviously then we'll have to do some adjusting.
Right. So we're getting close to the top of the hour. I just wonder if either of you have any additional thoughts. Senator Kuehn, again, I would ask sort of if you have any parting thoughts or recommendations for the legislature on any of these numbers. One question I wanted to ask you was, the legislature is talking about an incentive program. You were chair of performance audit. Now you're on forecasting. Whether you have any thoughts on that, or if not, any just general recommendations for the legislature.
Well, first, I do want to thank Open Sky and you for putting on this webinar, and all of the people who've decided to spend their lunch hour today really engaging in this issue, because I think it is really important for people who want to participate in the policy process to wrap their hands around what's happening at the forecasting board. It has really deep impacts on the policy decisions and the way our state operates. And I think the more eyes that are on that process, the better our government works. So first, I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate that and the opportunity to share information and insight onto the process. With regard to the incentives, again, it's all about transparency and numbers. I think what we see in times of uncertainty is that it complicates the forecast and it adds additional uncertainty into policy making. So, both in my roles as a state senator on appropriations and on performance audit, and now in my role on the forecasting board, transparency is the name of the game. So having as much information available so we can assess the actual cost and benefit of these packages. Incentives should be no different than any other legislative package. We should have the data to be able to say, is it working or is it not? And my role in performance audit, one of our challenges was that the prior packages did not require upfront reporting, which allowed the legislature to ultimately answer that question. And so anytime that we're using taxpayer money, especially when that taxpayer money is going to private business, the ability for the appropriators to be able to understand clearly what is the return on investment of that public money is absolutely essential. And so including those reporting mechanisms, the right information, the right data, so that the performance auditors have the ability to clearly answer that question. And then we don't have to have all these really colorful debates about what they will or will not do. We can prove that empirically. So evidence is king, and gathering the evidence as we go is a good component of all good public policy.
Great, thank you. Senator Stinner?
Yeah, thank you, Renee, for inviting me. Obviously, we've got some work to do. I've actually got to leave right now and get to a committee meeting where we're going to make some adjustments and do some technical cleanup on the budget. And then I have to probably sit down with the fiscal office and rework some of the out years, and so we can have an accurate fiscal status, financial status. And then it's up to me to kind of convey what I believe in as cautionary tones to the debate, and we'll just see where we come out.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your service. Thank you for taking time with us today. I can't believe how quickly this went. I really enjoyed it. I think it was really useful, and I'm sure all of the folks who were participating got a lot out of it. And I thank them, thank everyone for attending and for the great questions, and hope that everyone has a great afternoon. And thanks again to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renee.